Good morning, I'm Robin Winsor, and I'd like to share some thoughts with you about how artificial intelligence is going to change the world we live in, not a long time from now, but in the immediate future. Mark Twain famously said, "It ain't what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to it as we run through this talk today, because there's a lot of assumptions we make about facts that we're sure of that maybe we need to start rethinking. In the world of artificial intelligence, the pace of change is getting ever faster. But many of you will have heard that a few years ago, a program called AlphaGo managed to beat the world champion in the game of Go. Go is computationally more complex than chess, often thought to be, in fact, computationally intractable. And yet, an artificial intelligence program trained in all of the classical games, matched up initially against hobbyists, then strong competitors, and all the way up to the world champion, eventually beat that world champion and showed that a machine could indeed play this very complicated game. Something far more interesting happened the following year, when a program called AlphaGo Zero was matched against the world champion program, AlphaGo, from the year before. The difference, not just a faster computer or some more information, but in fact less information. AlphaGo Zero was given none of the human knowledge of the game, just how to play it. Black stones here, white stones there, the basic rules. And in a flash, playing against the informed program from the year before, AlphaGo Zero became the world champion, beating AlphaGo 100 games to none. And when human players who were real experts in the game watched how it was playing, they said it was like watching an alien, using strategies that they would never have thought of, or if they had thought of, would be thought foolish. And yet, unencumbered by human knowledge, the benefit of human knowledge, AlphaGo Zero performed much, much better than a human. So as we get into the world of artificial intelligence getting out of our labs, because AlphaGo Zero isn't going to be heading out to take on opponents on its own, as we see artificial intelligence going into self-driving vehicles, into unmanned aerial vehicles, into all sorts of things, it's getting out of the lab and experiencing the real world. And one of the things that we find is that anything that explores its environment starts to exhibit behavior that we think of as being like a brain. Could be a mosquito, could be a self-driving car, but if it gets out and manipulates its environment, it starts to show the signs of what we call thinking. So as our machines become more and more specialized, we face two waves of sweeping change. The first is in what we call narrow artificial intelligence, where machines learn to do things that we thought were only doable by humans. But often that machine, perhaps the self-driving car, is no use whatsoever in playing chess or Go. Eventually, though, these machines will merge and produce a system that is an artificial general intelligence, one that represents the sum of all human knowledge and goes well beyond it. That's probably a few decades away, but likely within the lifetime of most of us listening to this talk. So how we handle the first set of changes, where artificial intelligence displaces us from the jobs that we know and perhaps love, or perhaps don't, then that will tell us how we will handle the later change where we effectively are sharing the planet with a new intelligent species. So let's have a look at history, just to see how well we handle change. Back in the days of, I'm falling a couple of slides behind here, back in the days of books being produced by hand, monks would sit in a scriptorium producing beautiful works of art, illustrated Bibles that cost a fortune, were available to only a few, literacy was correspondingly low, And that was the way it was for a long time. But then in 1440, along comes the printing press. And with that, we find that books are suddenly becoming available to everyone. Does that change cause the monks to rise up and try and smash the printing presses? No, it doesn't, because it was a gradual change and one that didn't threaten people's livelihoods. A few hundred years later, though, the invention of mechanical loom, the spinning jenny, the jacquard loom, suddenly displaced the cottage industry that fed whole families as people gathered yarns, spun it into thread, and produced textiles. And one thing that we have found is that people will put up with a lot in terms of change. But if you threaten their ability to make a living, if they cannot put food on the table, especially if they cannot feed their children, you've sown the seeds of revolution. And from that industrialization of things like textile production, we start to see the rise of the Luddites, people who are trying to smash the new machinery. And indeed, in the early years of the Napoleonic Wars, the British had more troops on the, more troops in England fighting against the Luddites than they did on the continent fighting against Napoleon. So if that's the sort of thing that happens when we disrupt people's ability to earn a living, we really have reached a fork in the road where we have to choose how we're going to react to these new changes. Are we going to accept the changes and try and learn to live with them? Or are we going to fight back and try and put the genie back in the bottle? Because one thing's for sure is that we can't do that. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. If we don't adopt a technology, then somebody else will, and they'll have an advantage over us. So what does that mean as we go forward? Well, it means great promise, but also great challenge. A self-driving truck is fantastic, but when that self-driving truck passes by small towns that used to feed and house the truck drivers, then it's not just the truck drivers that have lost their jobs. It's the folks who work in the motel along the way, the folks who make up the rooms, who serve the breakfast. There's many, many jobs that are going to fall to the new combination of robotics and artificial intelligence. And with that, we are typically told by presenters talking about this topic that not to worry, there will be new jobs coming along that we can take, and we didn't really want the old jobs in the first place. Is that true though? I think what you'll find is that as new jobs come along, the machines will take those too, because the machines aren't just being trained to do one particular thing, to spin some textiles or to drive a car. The machines are becoming generally capable of doing almost everything. Do you really think that whatever you do is so special that a tireless robot or a fantastically intelligent computer cannot do it? Well, let's take a look at one of those jobs that is going to be challenged and challenged very soon, and that's teaching. Today, lots and lots of people are employed in education as teachers, and we certainly need education. No matter what happens, we're all going to need to teach our children. But in doing so, is the model that we will follow simply going to be the sage on the stage, the one teacher in front of a classroom? Has it always been this way? Is this the standard way of doing things? Well, no, it's not. Over time, the way that people were taught was typically from father to son, from mother to daughter. If your father was a shoemaker, you were probably going to be a shoemaker. Apprenticeship was the way that things were passed along, at least for the working poor. For the more wealthy among us, the model was to have a mentor. We get the word mentor from Homer's story where Odysseus asks mentor, an old family friend, to look after the education of his son while he's away at war. The idea of a wise older person teaching an individual is certainly a good model, but not one that we could afford over time. Of course, the rich have always had an advantage, and in Victorian England, children would have had a governess to teach them. That governess would have occupied an odd place in the household, not a servant per se, but certainly not one of the family. And she would have taught the children until they reached a certain age, the girls all the way through till their late teenage years. Boys would have been taught just until they were old enough to go off to a boarding school to get a more thorough education or a wider education than one person could provide. But imagine if that one governess could have provided every skill. Not obviously humanly possible, but we'll see where that's going in a moment. As the industrial age came along, small schools began to open in Canada, where I'm talking to you from this morning. We have the one-room schoolroom, which was a standard across the prairies, where all of the children of all ages were put together and taught by one teacher. Perhaps it was the same in the UK. But the model was not brought in because it was a better way of teaching. It was a better way of mass producing people who were needed for the industrial age, where they needed different skills. An interesting piece of that came from the Gresham College in the late 16th century, where they started producing lectures for the public. No fees, no degrees, no students, just topics for the public to educate the curious. That model in today's world has turned into what we call massively open online courses, which again would just be a talk with no feedback, much as I'm doing for you today, because unfortunately I'm not there to take questions. But one of the real turning points was when some artificial intelligence professors at Stanford University in 2001 managed to produce an artificial intelligence course, quite appropriately, that was graded by an artificial intelligence. And that allowed them to sign up an unlimited number of students. And in the first year, they enrolled 160,000 students. It was scalable because they didn't need one teacher to one student. And the reason they could do that was because of the ability to grade papers. But it still didn't have that feedback that we would really want. But as we come into the age of artificial intelligence, we have new capabilities. A good teacher knows the child, but an artificial intelligent teacher could know the child even better. Observing that child, we can look at subdermal blood flow, blink rate. We can actually monitor through things like this little headset that I've got here, which looks just like a regular headset. But this one actually senses brain waves. And if we can tell the brain waves at the same time, we can't read the mind, but we can observe the state of attentiveness, whether the child is learning, whether they're not. And we can do that one-to-one, or at least seemingly one-to-one. A teacher that stays with that child all the way from cradle to grave, always being there, always knowing that child, and seeming to be the perfect companion, the perfect mentor, if you will. And yet what's really happening? That AI would also be simultaneously teaching millions of other students and seeming to each of them to be personal, and could be changing how quickly it delivers a lesson based on their attention, based on that blink rate, and doing A/B testing to optimize, to do machine learning, which is what machines are really, really good at these days, to get the perfect education. Given that that's the case, why not start early? Why not start feeding that AI information right from the crib, observing the baby as he or she sleeps and watching every step as they grow so that they know them perfectly? Now, to some people, that seems like the perfect education. To others, it seems like a tremendous invasion of privacy. In Sweden, a school board decided to use facial recognition to take attendance at class, saving an administrative task that chews up quite a few minutes at the beginning of every day and allowing more for learning. Seems like a good idea, but in Swedish society, this was thought to be an unacceptable invasion of privacy, and a lawsuit soon shut that experiment down. But it's different cultures, different attitudes. If you look at what happened in China, when they did far more than just take attendance, they actually gave every child one of these brainwave sensing headsets and had a teaching assistant check which children were listening, which were not, which ones seemed to be struggling, by monitoring them all at a central console while the teacher delivered the lesson. That was seen by the parents of those children as giving them a tremendous advantage. And schools where the technology was not being implemented, the parents started to complain, saying, why are our children being left behind? We want their brainwaves sampled too. So there can be different ways of perceiving this. But as I've said before, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. The fact is that the technologies are coming along, and we can either adopt them in the best possible way or get left behind by those who don't. So what do we need to implement these technologies widely? Well, one of the things that we have to have if we're going to do it on a massive scale is we have to have truly global internet access. And companies like SpaceX that have learned how to reuse their boosters and putting up these days about 60 satellites every week, establishing a global internet and driving the costs down with those reusable boosters means that the entire planet will have internet from satellites within a year or two. Now, satellite internet up to now has been very poor quality because those satellites all parked 36,000 kilometers above the equator. And for those in middle latitudes down to equatorial zones, that wasn't much of a problem. But here in Canada, where we're a good deal further north for many of our remote communities, those satellites effectively mean that the dishes have to point through much thicker atmosphere to get to a signal to the equator. And that means poorer quality, that means interruption by snowstorms and bad weather. Whereas satellites in low Earth orbit, which is where the SpaceX satellites are going, aren't interfered with at all. So low-cost, ubiquitous internet is coming. Of course, if we're going to monitor millions and millions of students, potentially billions of students, we're also going to need a lot of computer power. And that computer power, today, yes, we have it, but it's going to be much more available once we have quantum computing. We're already seeing that some quantum computing is available from companies like D-Wave, and others like IBM and Google are starting to put more and more into quantum computing. And some of the results are truly astonishing. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on quantum computing, but for some things, such as optimization problems, Google is reporting 100 million times speed up over conventional computing. 100 million times. That is powerful computing resource. So if we have global internet and we have powerful computing, and it's getting much more powerful all the time, then what's to stop us implementing AI-based teaching? Well, not much, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it is a common saying. And for many places, be that Edinburgh, Glasgow, Calgary, where I am today in Canada, the school board system is not broken. It's doing okay. It's not perfect, and I think we'll soon find that it could be a lot better with an AI teacher. But the pressure isn't there to change it all. We have lots of schools, we have lots of teachers, we're not looking to change that. But in much of Africa, where there is widespread poverty in many areas, not all, but many, you'll find that education is often not available to everyone, and is particularly not available to girls. But in those areas, just as they have jumped across not having landlines and went to cell phones, you'll find that these days they've jumped across credit cards and are now using mobile pay for almost everything. Go through Kenya, and the smallest little town, smallest store, have got signs up showing you how you can use your mobile to pay. That means that in every house where a girl is being left at home and not being sent to school, there is a smartphone. And that smartphone can be the tutor that she needs to give her a fantastic education, one-on-one, apparently, to a perfect tutor that knows just about everything. That same situation can apply in remote communities the world over. Our First Nations in Canada often have poorer resources because they live in very, very small communities in remote areas. And by bringing education to them and being able to respect the cultural sensitivity of Indigenous people, we can get a much better result. Now, the pandemic has forced us all into suddenly using online education, but in many cases, it's no smarter than what I'm doing today, which is talking to you through a video link or a recorded session, and not allowing me to read every person in the audience and see who has questions and see whether or not the message is being received as I would want it to be. With the ability of small communities to get the first step in advanced AI-based education, when we start to see better results coming for people in remote communities where they don't have the benefit of a modern education system, but in fact have the one of the future, very quickly, the parents in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Calgary are going to say, we want our children educated by an AI and not by a teacher, not by a human teacher. Sounds wonderful, except if you happen to be a teacher, and it certainly has some concerns to it. Let's remember what Mark Twain told us about it's not what you don't know, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. If the curriculum is being set by the glorious leader of North Korea, then the educational materials that are being given to the children in tremendously advanced form by an AI could be very, very persuasive and very, very wrong. So the ability to set the curriculum turns out to be where the skills of that modern teacher really need to be in terms of determining what it is that's going to be fed down the AI pipeline to the children. So there's no resisting these changes. We have to take the fact that they're coming. So how do we cope? Because this one is going to be one of those changes that could create a revolution. How do you compete with robots when it comes to getting a job when the robots are tireless? They're incredibly intelligent. They have the sum of all knowledge and they never, ever make the same mistake twice. Well, that's not an easy thing to do, but it can be an opportunity as well as a threat. If we go back to 1776, Adam Smith, a very wise Scotsman, wrote The Wealth of Nations and laid out the fundamental principles of capitalism about the division of labor and the pricing of labor and commodities. But if everything in the future is going to be produced by robots, the raw materials are going to be produced by robots, the knowledge workers are going to be artificial intelligence, then we're not going to need the division of labor. We're not going to need to price it as a scarce resource. And that will lead us to a world with one of two models. We'll either have a world of tremendous wealth for a few and handouts, hopefully, for the rest of us, or we're going to have to find some other system. And this isn't socialism versus communism versus capitalism. This is a post-human labor question of how we divide up the wealth of our society. If we don't want to live in a world of the super rich and of inequality, we're going to have to find some way of distributing things in a more fair manner. And I would encourage all of you to look into something that's more of the conversation today than it was a few years ago, but it's still flying a little bit under the radar, and that is universal basic income. Universal basic income has been shown in all sorts of trials, quite recently in one in Vancouver, Canada, that a small bit of regular income to people will allow them to stay in a situation where they can look after themselves. It helps to get ahead of homelessness. It helps to get ahead of the limits of unemployment. But don't just think of UBI as a handout for the poorest in society. Because yes, it helps the unemployed, but remember, the unemployed will be almost all of us as the robots and the AIs come for our jobs. And we're not going to be able to resist that. If you're a teacher, you're going to be looking to UBI. If you're a professor at the university, you're going to be looking to UBI. If you're a lawyer or a doctor or a veterinarian, all these things will fall to the machines and the AIs. And that's a good thing if we can figure out how to make the best of it and how to fairly share the wealth. Now, some people will not rise to the challenge of lack of employment and the ability to have their basic needs met. Some of us just will not make it. It will not seem to be enough of a driver. But I think that what we will find is the nature of human nature. And for many of us, that world where we have fantastic education, our basic needs met, will be a world where we really can get out and explore, not just our world, but other worlds, make the very best of ourselves, and make a very, very wonderful society where we are not facing vast inequality, but a much more equal and caring society. So fasten your seatbelts, folks. The next decade or so is going to be a very, very turbulent time. I would encourage you to try and be not just a passenger, but a pilot. Figure out how you can help to drive this revolution in artificial intelligence and fundamental change of our society forward. Because make no mistake, while it's a little scary to think of the changes that are coming, this could be the golden age of humanity. And we can all benefit from that. Thanks very much and enjoy DataFest. I know that there's going to be lots of great talks and I wish I could be with you. But this year I can't, maybe next year, who knows? If we can put COVID behind us, something for us all to look forward to. Thanks for being with me today.